How can myeloma genetics predict the risk of myeloma progressing?
So I'll give you an example of how we're using this. This is a study we published almost 15 years ago now, where we actually looked at how we could create these different subtypes of myeloma. This is always something that is evolving. And we said, okay, if you have these markers, what is the likelihood that you're going to have events sooner? Now, if you look at this curve and you go back at the one we have here, you see quite a difference in how the slope of those curves has changed. Back then, it was mostly the melphalan and the dexamethasone we had for these patients, but none of the new drugs. But at the time, we realized what you see in the blue curve means that that's kind of the most risky and dangerous situation. Back then was patients who have this abnormalities, what we call the translocations, the 414, 1416, and the loss of a little segment of chromosome 17. And if you read the medical literature, this still remains as one of the key ways in which we myeloma doctors think about more aggressive forms of myeloma. There's even better ways to determine this right now, but this is how most of the medical literature still is reported. I don't think it is crucial to explain the technicalities of how translocations occur. Just know that a translocation is, I call them a little bit like swinger chromosomes. So you have a chromosome 14 here, you have a chromosome 11, and 14 normally is going through a lot of, cut and paste, cut and paste, cut and paste. And if it just happens to be very close to, for instance, 11, if someone has an 11-14 and 11 has a break, they switch partners. So now it's 14 with a little segment of 11 and an 11 with a little switch, a little fragment of 14. It's kind of like pens exchanging their caps, if you may. That's what a translocation is, and that is one of the key seminal events that gives rise to myeloma. Now, and that we use that, and we've used that over the years. Now, this is very, very important, and I know I see some faces in the audience that I know you know this. This is not deterministic at 100%. It just tells us there's a high risk that things may not go the way we want. In fact, we have patients who have these markers who can do very, very well in the long term. It just changes how we think about things. It's not like you got this and it is predetermined that you're going to have this outcome. Likewise, we sometimes unfortunately see situations where someone doesn't have any of these high-risk markers, and yet, the clinical course is that, it's more aggressive. So none of this is deterministic. It just gives us a framework on how we start thinking about this myeloma cells.
How can you know your level of risk?
The easy way to know whether you're low risk or high risk that's not that sensitive, but it's easy to get, is when you're initially diagnosed, before you've received any treatment. 2 tests are performed, beta-2 microglobulin and albumin. The tests just roll off the tongue, don't they? And you can see that if your beta-2 microglobulin is low on the top row, these patients have more sensitive disease. And on the bottom, beta-2 microglobulin higher, these patients have more chemotherapy-resistant disease. This was published a really long time ago, based on patients treated an even longer time ago. So ignore the columns on the right. This does not suggest the survivals that are accurate or indicative of what is expected today. But what this talks about and reflects the biology of the myeloma, that is still accurate. A high beta-2 microglobulin before the treatment is always a bad thing. Now, you'll notice that that's just blood tests, and that's only part of the game. That is a very insensitive measure of risk, of how aggressive or how hard to treat the patient's myeloma is. Really, we want to add in the genetics, a little bit more information about these myeloma cells to complement the blood test obtained prior to treatment. So we developed a revised international staging system, which is slightly more complicated. And you can see the beta-2 microglobulin is still there. You can see it down there at stage 3, so the criteria is there. But now we add in primarily some genetics. And we use terminology that's very difficult for normal people to understand. We'll think of most of you, except those in the front row on the right-hand side, as normal people. And this is hard for you to understand because no one speaks like this normally. So you're going to see these acronyms, and since you're already here, you've probably gone on the internet, looked at the myeloma, these acronyms will come up a bunch. So NODEL17P is code word for the short arm of the 17th chromosome in your myeloma cells, but not your normal cells, is missing. And this suggests that you have higher risk myeloma. Those T414, 1416, that's when part of the 14th, 4th, and 14th chromosome got together when they shouldn't be getting together. And same with the 14th and 16th. These create proteins in the myeloma cells, giving them tools to fight chemotherapy more than patients with low-risk disease. And hence, the presence of any one of these changes pushes a patient to more higher risk myeloma, more chemotherapy resistance, and thus a shorter survival. So primarily, these are obtained by doing either a karyotype, which we honestly don't do at OSU anymore. You get newly diagnosed myeloma, we don't do a karyotype because it's so often negative and so often useless that why do it? And a karyotype is a lot because you're essentially putting myeloma cells in a dish and expecting them to reproduce. And myeloma cells are just like my in-laws. They're absolutely incapable of being in a foreign environment, reproducing, being fertile, and going on and flourishing. They need to have their separate, special environment that they've created in order to survive and do well. So myeloma cells are just like my in-laws. They're not going to survive in a dish. And in general, what you do is put some myeloma cells immediately after a bone marrow biopsy and stain them for specific mutations which describe high-risk disease. The ones that we look at patients with a deletion of the short arm of chromosome 1, the short arm of chromosome 17. These translocations, people who are getting together who should not get together, and how many of us know people who have gotten together who should not be together. And lastly, a 414 translocation with a number of other things that increase this patient's sensitivity to, or decrease the patient's sensitivity to treatment. We often like to say that if you have a FISH or a karyotype that are both normal and you're newly diagnosed, they didn't have any myeloma cells to test. One or both of these tests are going to be abnormal in a newly diagnosed patient virtually every last time. And if it's not abnormal, they didn't have any myeloma cells to test.
Can you talk about risk and gene expression profiling?
There's other ways in which we can talk about risk, and one of them is this gene expression profiling, and you probably will hear a bit more from Dr. Morgan, which can, it's another way to look at prognosis and try to separate those patients that actually may have a more aggressive form of myeloma. So that's one of the ways. There's actually a commercial assay that's available too for doing this through this Sky company that can test for the high risk markers. Now, one of the things to think about with these two things is that, again, number one, prognosis is not determinant. It's not a black and white. You have this, you're going to do well. You have this, you're going to do bad. We still are going to work together through those things. And the other thing is that these are only approximations because there's many other things that come into play. If you come to the clinic and a person has severe diabetes and heart failure, it's going to be a lot harder to get going through the completion of the treatment. So all of that plays out on how we're able to propose different treatments for patients.
It's important to know what type of myeloma each person has because we cannot treat everybody as if they're the same. We know that some people are more sensitive to treatment and have much longer survival, and other people have very aggressive and very resistant myeloma that despite of chemotherapy, their disease tends to come back very quickly or does not respond well to treatment. So if somebody has a diagnosis of multiple myeloma, that's not enough for us to be able to know what are the best ways of managing your treatment and to plan your treatment for the future. Even though the induction and the transplant portion of treatment tend to be the same, regardless of the cytogenetics, it is important to know that the type of cytogenetics and if you're high risk or low risk or standard risk, so that you can establish a proper maintenance. So high-risk cytogenetics at the beginning when somebody's diagnosed is important so that we can have an idea of not just the type of disease that you have, but is this a disease that's going to be hard to fight? Is this a disease that's going to be wanting to come back quicker and us have to be more cautious and surveil more frequently to look for relapses? Or is this a disease that is going to be more easygoing and hopefully easier to treat, that by the time we put it in remission, there's a better chance that that person is going to stay in remission for a longer time? So even though at the beginning it might not seem like a necessary thing for a patient because they say, well, why would I need to know my mutations and my cancer if the induction therapy is going to be the same with 3 different agents, and I'm still probably going to go to transplant after finishing induction. There are now some debates as to whether certain medicines should be used in high-risk disease as part of the induction. And there are clinical trials currently comparing the use of carfilzomib instead of bortezomib in high-risk disease patients, and if there is an added benefit or better control of this disease by using this change in the triplets that we use as part of the induction. Just to give a simple example or a comparison, if your husband or your wife comes home and says, I want a car, can you buy me a car? You're not going to say, sure, you can go and buy a car. You're going to want to know more details of the car, what brand and what model, what make and model of that car, so that you can have an idea of how expensive it's going to be, how much maintenance you're going to need, if it's going to be something that you can afford or not, if it's going to be a luxurious thing, if it's going to be something that adapts well to your family or not. And the same thing happens with cancer. When somebody has multiple myeloma, we want to know as many details as possible so we can have a better understanding of what we're dealing with, so we can have a better way of handling it, managing it, and at the same time have better information that we can provide to the patients so that they can have a better understanding of what to expect in the near future and how to plan their life accordingly.